So everyone, thank you for being here tonight. Um, this feels, we've been here now, I guess in the pandemic for about a year. And so I'm excited to have Garth and Reese and Brandon and Melissa joining us. We'll wait a second for them to. Hi, Garth.
Hi everybody. Thanks so much for being here tonight.
Hi, everyone. We're so excited you're here. Hi, everyone.
Yes. Yeah, it's exciting to have everyone here. Like I was saying, we've been in this pandemic for like about a year now. And so it's nice to have this many people joining us in this conversation. It feels a bit like a literary salon. And, I'm really excited for tonight's conversation. Again, want to thank the ASL interpreters for tonight and the Strand and Scripps events. And a few of my colleagues who helped me prep for tonight's conversation. So I thought that we'd begin by opening up with a short reading from you, Reese. Would you mind reading from your story in the anthology Safe Word?
Of course. Thank you so much, Jared. And hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Penn and the Strand and Scripps and Jared and Samir and Karina. Thank you to Brandon and Melissa. Thank you to Garth, my wonderful co-editor. We've been working on this book since 2017, and it's really just wild and incredible to see it come to life. So I'm going to read from my story in here. It's called Safe Word, the story. And I'll read about 2 pages in. It begins with a couple, Paul and Cheon. They're going to an appointment with a dominatrix in the latter's dungeon. And so they're in the dungeon, and then Paul's sort of remembering what led up to this. So much was his fault. Like a jackass, he pushed her and pushed her. A month ago, he'd interrupted the back massage he was giving her. Harder, she kept saying, to ask if there was anything else she wanted to try in bed. Cheon? Paul said, after a moment. It was possible she was asleep, but it was even more possible she was pretending this wasn't happening. They were like 2/3 of a bar joke. He was an ex-Pentecostal, she was an ex-Catholic, and though she'd been with him for 3 years, she still refused to let him in the bathroom if she was so much as taking a piss. Cheon, he repeated, running a knuckle up the long knobbed curve of her neck. He was straddling her. She was lying on her stomach in her bra and panties. No, I'm fine, she said. Thank you, though. Really? There's nothing? He said. Come on, there must be some fantasy you've never told me about. There's not even one other thing you want to try? He brought this up as a joke, mostly, and also, of course, because he kind of wanted her to ask him what other fantasies he had. But now that she was being so evasive, he had to wonder, was she lying? She twisted her neck to look up at him. Paul, she said, too gently, are you bored? No, he said. Quickly, before she had time to think, he said, but you are. Then came the denials, the expostulations of what the hell are you talking about? And then, if only to prove him wrong, she pulled off his boxers and bounced on top of him for a long athletic display of just how bored she was not. But after she'd fallen asleep, her head huddled under his chin, he lay awake, wondering. A year married, 3 together. Say they had sex every 3 days on average. Once every 3 days, 121.7 fucks a year, so 365 times they played hide the salami, the same stick in the same hole, the stick in the hole, the stick in the hole, the stick in the... Who wouldn't feel bored? The fact that he hadn't yet meant nothing. He was an outlier. Recently, he'd eaten the same lomito every weekday for a month from the Chilean sandwich place next to his office because it was good. Tasty, filling, reliable. Why mess around? Maybe he should make the straightforward effort and believe his wife when she said she was fine, but now that he was thinking about it, he couldn't, not really. She was so kind to him that she couldn't be trusted. Over the next couple of weeks, he brought up the question every now and then, teasing her, and though she brushed him off each time, he shouldn't have been as surprised as he was when, one night, she shook him awake. It couldn't have taken long. He slept lightly, fearfully, because anything could happen. He opened his eyes and Cheon was sitting cross-legged, her hands folded in her lap. Fine, she said. If you really have to know, I think it's gone, but it comes back. What? He said, thinking she'd had a bad dream. It was only when he reached for her hands, her palms damp and electric, that he realized she was crying. Cheon, what is it? What comes back? There's something a little wrong with me, she said, each word enunciated it, as if she were reciting a speech. You're going to hate this. Sometimes I really need you to hurt me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reese. That was great. And you know, I'm going to get into your story specifically as the conversation moves on. But off of that, I just kind of wanted to ask you, and Garth, also feel free to chime in, but kind of how this book came about. You know, where did the idea for it stem from? Where were you? You mentioned it was 2017. Why an anthology? These kind of initial questions.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Jared. Well, I was at a residency in New Hampshire. I was at McDowell, the artist residency, and I had just published an earlier version of the story in Playboy. And in a lot of ways, like it was the most, at the time, it was the most sexually explicit piece of fiction I'd ever written. And I think especially with it coming out in Playboy, I've been a woman on the internet for like a bit, and I was like, I need to prepare myself for like the weird messages I'm almost certainly going to get. And to my great surprise and delight, most of the messages I got were not at all weird or hostile. They were actually really lovely. And a lot of people were saying, thank you for writing this. I felt less alone. So I was thinking about that. And I came across Garth's piece, a version of which is in this anthology. I came across his piece in the Paris Review, which is also excerpted from his most recent wonderful book, Cleanness. And right then I also read Melissa's first book, Whip Smart. And I think I was just like sitting in the McDowell library, and I was like, you know, it would be so wonderful if like stories like this could live together in a book. Stories like this could live together in a book that would go on these shelves. And what if I could help make that happen? And I knew Garth lightly because I'd interviewed him upon the publication of his first book, What Belongs to You. And so I just like emailed him. And to my great joy, he said yes. He said yes, he was into it, let's do it.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and so then Garth also then, you know, how did the book, after Reese initially reached out to you, and you guys were speaking about it, how did the book just kind of, you know, evolve? Like, how did you decide on this title, Kink? And what were your thoughts in terms of the writers you wanted to then reach out to and the type of representation you wanted to have as they wrote about kink?
Yeah, so I mean, when Reese approached me about the project, I was immediately really excited about it. I, you know, was obviously, I knew Reese's work and I love her as a writer. And so I felt like aesthetically we would probably be excited by similar things. And we started brainstorming a list of contributors who we wanted to approach. And before we, you know, tried to find a publisher for the book. And, you know, we were pretty careful crafting the letter that we wanted to send to those potential contributors, and making clear that, you know, from the very beginning, we knew that we did not want to be in the business of trying to put a definition on kink or trying to sort of say there's a kinky club and deciding who gets to be in it or doesn't. I mean, I think one of the kind of thrilling and potentially subversive things about kink is its allergy to definitions. And so we wrote this letter soliciting work that the writers felt in some important way centered kink, whatever that meant to them. And we were thrilled by the fact that almost everyone we approached was really excited to be part of the project. As for the title, Reese will have to correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misremembering, but I think so. The book, the editor we've worked with on the book is wonderful Zach Knoll from Simon & Schuster. The editor who acquired it was the very brilliant Ira Silverberg. And my memory is that it was actually Ira who first suggested the title Kink. And I remember texting with Reese about it and being like, well, yeah, maybe that's, you know, like, is that too on the nose or is that actually exactly perfect? But Reese, am I remembering that right?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but Garth, I think you're right. I think we had a different working title for when we sold the book, and that was one of the only, that might have been the like first piece of feedback from Ira saying, what about changing the title? And we were just like, yeah, I think we like that.
Oh, that's great. That's a great story. I then, in thinking about that, then I want to ask Melissa and Brandon, being on the end of receiving the invitation to contribute to this anthology, what made you interested in writing about this theme? Yeah, let's start there. I think I have a follow-up question, but let's start there.
Okay, I'll start. I just want to get out of the way before I say anything else and forget that I want to know what the first title was. I have like a specific weird vested interest in knowing what the like forgotten titles were for books. Maybe because I still cherish my own. But I will say that sort of, as Reese sort of alluded to, my first book was about kink in many ways, in a very sort of direct way, and in a way that sort of conjures a lot of the iconic images that come to mind when you say the word kink. And it was sort of the nature of that careful invitation that was so capacious in its definition of kink, or in its willingness to sort of entertain whatever our definition of kink was, that felt so appealing to me, because I didn't want to reiterate my first book in any direct way. And I knew that it would be something very different. And I was so excited by the idea of an assignment to sort of really contemplate what that word means to me now. And I was utterly surprised by what came out. And I don't think I would have written it any other way. So I'm really grateful to them.
Yeah, I think Garth asked me if I had an interest or would be interested in contributing something to this anthology. I think Garth told me that he was working with Reese on putting together an anthology. And I was like, wow, that sounds so amazing. And then I think like 2 weeks later, Garth emailed me and he's like, would you like to contribute? And I was like, oh my gosh, and hadn't thought about me being a part of it. I was just like, ooh, who's he gonna ask? It's gonna be so great. And yeah, and so when I went to I'm like a very lazy work-averse person, and so my first instinct was immediately like, do I have anything that might fit the brief? Because I don't want to have to write, And I thought, oh, I have this one story where a character spits in another guy's mouth, and that's like the kinkiest thing I've ever, like, would that work? And I sent it to Garth, and he was really lovely about it and shared it with Reese, and they were just really wonderful about the story. I mean, I felt very anxious about this story because I was still a grad student when I wrote it, and I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. All of these like complicated human questions of like intimacy and capitalism and commerce and fraught sexual intimacies. I have no idea what I'm doing. And it just felt, I don't know, they made me feel so safe in sort of sending it out into the world. And it's been an amazing project to see take shape these last, I guess, 4 years? What on earth?
Yes, 2017, over 2021, yeah, 4 years. It's great to see it all come together. Melissa, would you mind reading from your story, The Cure, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Okay, I'm just gonna be weird and set my timer because I'm terrified of being that person. Okay. I'm gonna pick up sort of in the middle. He had not been a pretty child, she knew from pictures, gangly with incongruent features, and she could already see that he wouldn't age well. He had thin lips and pale skin and dark hair that was already receding, but he was tall and broad-shouldered with strong cheekbones and a pretty cock. She knew that the window of time during which she had known him would be the one in which he was beautiful. He was a nice guy, she'd always thought, by which she meant he wasn't terrible. She cooks him a veggie burger at this part, and I'm skipping over it. He was not a good kisser. As they backed toward her bed, she wondered if fucking a man would be similar to watching porn featuring men, which she sometimes did. That is, would she want to disappear him the instant he came? When masturbating to porn, she often closed the laptop before her orgasm had even completed its arc. Nothing was more grim than pornography post-orgasm. His cock was not grim, thankfully. It was shapely and hard, and she liked the feeling of it on her thigh as he sucked on her nipple. There was a thrill as he penetrated her, owing in some part to novelty. Within a couple of minutes, however, it became the familiar tedium of being thrust upon. She knew what came next, and it was not her. Still, she dutifully turned over onto her hands and knees and let him fuck her from behind. It took a good 5 minutes for her to realize that she was waiting for it to be over. It took another 5 for her to work up the gumption to tell him to stop mid-thrust. But then, before she could speak, he sputtered to a finish, and there was no need. She wanted him to leave afterward, but he seemed to assume that he would be staying over, and she was very sleepy. When he curled up against her as a big spoon, she scooted into him. This was a position she was used to, having been shorter than all of her past sleeping partners. But those people had been women. His size made her feel claustrophobic and overheated. His body hair prickled her unpleasantly, and his profusion of sweat repulsed her. A person only wants to be drenched in the sweat of someone she loves, and not always then. With a calculated shifting, she nudged him away from her, and eventually he yielded, content to press his face into her shoulder. His breath shuddered against her neck, slightly congested, like that of a child. In the morning, she dressed for work, and together they walked to the cafe before parting ways, each with a coffee in hand. She kissed him on the cheek, pretended not to see the moony look on his face, and walked purposefully toward the train. Confirming that he was out of view, she strode past the station and walked home. It was her day off. When she closed the apartment door behind her, the pleasure of solitude was so great that she closed her eyes and leaned back against the door with a vocal sigh. She drank a glass of water and made her bed. Her bedroom, having been intruded upon by his presence, felt sanctified in his absence. She took off her clothes and lay on the taut blanket. She did not watch pornography. She thought about stopping him as soon as the sex became boring to her. She thought about stopping the moment it became an exercise in placation. The orgasm was deep and silent, the kind that opens a room in the body and then fills it with light. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. You both, all of you in your own way kind of talked about it. Brandon, you talked about kind of, you already had a piece, and that was kind of being one of my kind of follow-up questions. I know, Garth, you had a version of the piece, and Reese, you had just published yours. What went into, I guess, when thinking about the anthology, were there any edits or changes you made to, I guess, as you thought about Kink specifically, and specifically what your intentions were for this project? Or Melissa, did you already have a piece already? Since I'm not sure, like I heard that you had one. Was this like an exercise for you to sit down and kind of think about what Kink meant to you and relevant to this project?
Yeah, I did not have this piece written. And in fact, I hadn't written fiction in a number of years, like maybe 4 or 5 years. And so it was sort of with a pounding heart that I very quickly said yes, because I knew I wanted that assignment, but I had no idea what I would write, or really even if I could, in a way, because I hadn't written fiction in so long. And it really did become sort of something that I ruminated on for a while, and which was a really powerful exercise, like for me as a person and for the creative process of writing the story, because I hadn't considered in that particular way, like since, 7 years before, almost 10 years, it was 10 years before that I had written my first book, which was about working as a pro dom. And I hadn't really thought in that direct way, like, how has my definition of kink changed? Like, what is kinky to me now? I know that it's not the same thing that was then. And I was really surprised when this like very sort of psychological, kind of interior version of kink emerged in the fiction. And it was this really amazing sort of experience of discovery on the page, and also in myself, that wouldn't have taken place without these two editors.
Well, and I'll say following that we were like immediately so electrified by Melissa's story, and one of the things that was exciting to us was that it didn't have the usual accoutrements of a kind of stereotypical idea of kink. And something that I love about the book is that I think the stories approach the idea of kink in really different ways, and in fact, to such an extent that I think, at least one reviewer has been like, I don't think all of these stories are kinky. And I think there are some stories where you have to sort of sit with it and, you know, and kind of say, well, wait, this isn't a kink that I've seen before. But that's really exciting to me, you know, to think about like what, and, you know, it's something that Reese and I have been thinking about together, I think, and kind of on the fly as we've been doing interviews about the book, is sort of, you know, what does kink mean to us? You know, what are the sort of shadowy, non-definite parameters of kink? And I think, you know, something about theatricality, something about negotiation, something about not taking the idea or form of sex for granted, you know, not pretending or deluding ourselves that anything about sex is natural. That sort of all of these things, that sex is something that we stage, sex is something that we figure out, that we negotiate with each other. I think that's something that all of the stories show in really different ways. And then some of the stories do have handcuffs and whips and, you know, all of those things too.
Well, oh, sorry, Reese, you're gonna say
Oh
something?
no. Well, I was just going to add that in terms of the editing process, I'd say a really enjoyable part. I mean, there was so much that was really enjoyable about putting this book together, especially with this group of people. But an enjoyable part was also editing with another person, you know, with Garth and at times with Zach too. And I think that like we were all kind of, as far as I could tell, we were all kind of, I remember the first time Garth and I had a like editorial conversation of like, how do we want to edit? Like, how do we want to work on this together? Garth was like, I just like asking questions. I don't like making statements. And I was like, fuck yeah, I'm on that page too. Like, and so that was also just like a really fun thing to do, to get to engage, because editing is of course a somewhat different way of engaging deeply with writing, and that was a blast.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I wanted to, I guess then, since you two last spoke, Garth, would you gonna go into your story, please? And I forgive my pronunciation, Gospodar. is, is that?
Yeah, so I'm just going to read one paragraph, and not a very long paragraph. But so this is a story called Gospodar. Gospodar is the Bulgarian word for master or lord. The narrator of the story is an American living and teaching high school in Sofia, Bulgaria. And he's meeting an older man, an older Bulgarian man for the first time. They've chatted online a few times. He's meeting for a particular kind of rough encounter, I guess. And I think you only need to know one word of Bulgarian, which is the word kuchko, which is the word bitch, and it's an exact equivalent. It means female dog. But there's a trick in Bulgarian, which is that Bulgarian has a vocative case. So the form of the word is the form you use when you address someone. And in a weird way in this story, it becomes almost an endearment between them. It becomes a kind of tenderness for at least part of the story. So he let go of my hair then, freeing his hand to move down the side of my face, almost stroking it before he cupped it in his palm. It was a tender gesture, and his voice was tender too as he said, Kuchko, addressing me as if solicitously and tilting my head so that we gazed at each other face to face. His fingers flexed against my cheek almost in a caress. I leaned my head into him, resting it on his palm as he spoke again in that tone of tenderness or solicitude. Tell me, Kuchko, tell me what you want. And I did tell him, at first slowly and with the usual words, reciting the script that both does and does not express my desires, and then I spoke more quickly and more searchingly, drawn forward by the tone of his voice, what seemed like tenderness, although it was not tenderness, until I found myself suddenly in some recess or depth where I had never been. There were things I could say in his language, because I spoke it poorly, without self-consciousness or shame, as if there were something in me unreachable in my own language, something I could reach only with that blunter instrument by which I too was made a blunter instrument. And I found myself at last at the end of my strange litany saying again and again, I want to be nothing, I want to be nothing. Good, the man said, good. speaking with the same tenderness and smiling a little as he cupped my face in his palm and bent forward, bringing his own face to mine as if to kiss me, I thought, which surprised me, though I would have welcomed it. Good, he said a third time, his hand letting go of my cheek and taking hold of my hair again, forcing my neck farther back, and then suddenly and with great force, he spat into my face.
Thank you. And so off of that, I wanted to ask you, and everyone else, please chime in. About the language of like sexuality, and how actions and words can bend and change meaning based on context. As you note in your story, like in your character, the narrator, he speaks about like the pleasure of service. I want to be nothing, he repeats, and Reese as well. Like in your story, and you described it a bit, but this couple that goes to see a dominatrix at the girlfriend's request. I remember reading the story, and I heard it as the boyfriend hears it when the girlfriend tells him, "Sometimes I need you to hurt me," and that's the mindset I first heard it in, right? And it's kind of surprise, how he might interpret that. They're referring to in terms of referring to her sexual desires. But later on, when the narrator describes the couple's agreed upon safe word and says, quote, "It terrified the boyfriend to hurt her," I found myself then angry at the boyfriend because I read the word hurt in the mindset of the girlfriend. The context of the word hurt had changed for me as the story progressed. And, that moment kind of clicked where the boyfriend wasn't listening, and like the communication with language wasn't there, and made me think about that. And because hurt meant something differently to how he understood it, and kind of similar to the actions in your story, Garth, in terms of thinking about what it means to want to be spat on or later on whipped in the story. And I just want to talk about that a bit, like communication and like, I guess how we as a society place meaning on words and actions, particularly within the realm of kink and sex, and as if they're finite, and how you all explored that in your stories.
I guess I'll start, maybe. So yeah, I mean, so the reason that I think sex is such an interesting subject for literature is that I think sex is one of our most densely impacted forms of communication. I think there's just a ton of information being passed back and forth when we have sex, and that it's hard to pin that down, and that makes it interesting to write about. Something that Reese and I, as we did interviews, found ourselves reacting against was the idea that someone outside of a particular sexual encounter could interpret the meaning of a specific gesture or action. So I remember there was one interview where an interviewer said, in this scene where these people, this person does something that's so mean to the other person. And I said, well, wait, actually, no, you don't get to say that. You don't get to interpret that. Something that I think makes kink such a powerful technology of transformation is that kink can take a particular action that maybe has, or a particular word that maybe has a certain meaning in a different context, say something like the word faggot, that maybe is a word of violence. Well, within the aesthetic frame that an S&M encounter draws, that the meaning of that word, it's as though that word can be placed in a different grammar and can have a sort of a different meaning. And so there's a way in which something that might have been an instrument of violence against us can instead become an instrument of pleasure. And I think that's true of words. I also think it's true of gestures. So that spitting in someone's face means something very different when it's part of an S&M, this aesthetic act that is an S&M encounter. So, I mean, to me, the reason sex is interesting to write about, the reason kink is interesting to write about, is because these are profound acts of meaning making. And they're acts of meaning making that happen with multiple people. And so there's a lot going on. There are a lot of moving parts, and there's something very exciting in that, I think, for a writer.
That is so beautiful. And Jared, what you're saying about the word hurt is so gorgeous. Don't you all, this is like the most fun. This is like the first party I want to attend. If and when we're vaccinated, if and when we can gather, I want to attend a party with y'all and just like get drunk and talk about this stuff. But I guess what I'll add to that is, to want anything is to put yourself into a position of vulnerability, right? Like to want a glass of water is already to be in a slightly less stable state than when you don't need the water. And anything we want with our bodies, anything we want for our bodies, that can be so fraught for so many people. And I just think that there's so many people who have to live with wanting to not want what they want. And so like the want itself, you're trying to reject the want itself. And I just don't think we should have to live that way. When it comes to consensual activities, when it comes to, consensual activities, you're not really hurting anyone. Like, how is this anyone else's business? How is this stigmatized? I just would love to live in a world where there's less of this rejection of what our bodies are telling us.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else, if Brandon or Melissa wanted to chime in. If not, I'm gonna ask Brandon to read from his story, O Youth.
Okay. I ditto what everyone said. I mean, I think for me, the way that I've been thinking about kink since being in this book, I'm like, what is kink? I don't know what that is. I actually have no idea. And I've been listening a lot to the interviews and reading a lot of the interviews that Garth and Reese have been doing. And I think I've ended up somewhere more or less where Garth and Reese are, in which I think that kink is a way of kink is a way of like safely making oneself vulnerable to experience. Like kink is a way of like setting your parameters for engagement with experience and modulating that experience and opening oneself to certain kinds of experience that might, outside of the context of a sort of kinky encounter, it might be fraught or dangerous or what have you. So that's more or less where I've ended up, which is to say that kink is context. And I feel like I'm turning into a French philosopher. So I'm just going to read from the very beginning of O Youth. The dinner party was almost over. Grisha smoked out on the terrace, his shadow on the lawn. The other guests had stopped smoking some years before, or so they'd said when Grisha had excused himself. They had smiled and nodded, their dental implants slightly discolored from coffee and wine and life, the flash of their grayed canines. Oh, youth. The house was nestled near the milky blue pond in the heart of the arboretum. It belonged to James, who was a friend of Victor and Enid, and his second wife, Ramona, who Grisha sensed almost immediately was not. At the start of the evening, Ramona had opened the door for them, and Grisha had found himself involuntarily staring at her dark lipstick and the large growth on her neck. She had seemed to brace herself as she let them in, not saying welcome or hello so much as humming tightly in the back of her throat. It was a sign, Grisha thought, of how the night would go. The air was cool and damp, overhead a field of glinting white stars, quiet except for the music streaming through a window somewhere around the front of the house near the garden. Here you are, Enid called from behind him. Grisha turned and watched her approach through the low cloud of cigarette smoke. She was a tall woman in her late 50s, beautiful in the way that certain women become later in life, as though all their years of plainness had been rewarded with a sudden flare of beauty. Her hair was naturally light, a soft gray, cold color, and her eyes were quite close together, which made her gaze censorious and accusatory. I found you, she sang. I wasn't hiding, he said. I told you I'd be out here. That's a filthy habit, she said, plucking the cigarette from his mouth. She did not inhale, just let the filter press to the surface of her lips. He watched her watch him. A dark gnat landed on her collarbone. Her face was caught up in the pool of shadow between their bodies, and her expression became vague, inscrutable. So I've heard, he said. It's not personal, baby. Don't pout. She inhaled, folded her arms, and put her head back a little. It's so bad. That must be why it tastes so good. You sound like a cigarette commercial, he said. He put his hands in his pockets and looked away from her. She came closer to him in the dark. You can't be old enough to remember cigarette commercials, she said. What are you, 25? 25, he confirmed, smiling, feeling his face go taut. Do you know what I was doing when I was 25? No, he said. She blew the smoke up into his face. It was sweet and pungent. He breathed it in. Married, she said. Married to Victor, living in Portland. Another life, he said, laughing. Stop there.
Thank you so much, Brandon. In your story, among other things, there's a financial component, to power in your story. And later on, as the story develops, I don't want to give it away for people, but there are other things that complicate the story. But I wanted to ask you, and then again, if everyone else wants to chime in, feel free to. But what you think Kink's relationship is to power, and how does power, I guess, fit into the piece that you contributed to the anthology?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. When I first wrote the story, there's a moment in the story where Grisha spits in a man's mouth, and the first time I wrote this story, that scene wasn't in there. So it's just like a story about a guy who's an architecture student who's like hanging out with these older people all summer, and like that's what he's doing, is like going to parties, because I desperately wanted to write a story about architecture and dinner parties. And but I knew that something like really I knew that there was something sort of boiling beneath the surface of all of that. Like I knew that there was something like very tense happening beneath the surface, but I couldn't access it. And for me, like finding that scene where he does that with Victor and like moving into the realm of the explicit, like some of the sexual things that they were doing together, like really cracking open that realm of language for the story was what solved the story for me. So like the story was like in all these like weird disparate scenes, and I was like, it's all very hot, but I don't know what anyone is feeling here. And so the minute I understood that sex was at play and money was at play and power was at play, that sort of set up all the vectors in the story for me. And so my way into the sort of deeper subterranean realm of the story was through understanding that 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 there was an exchange of desire happening, that Grisha had something that they wanted and they had something that Grisha wanted and needed, and that there was an exchange happening. And understanding that allowed me to find like really concrete specific language, not only like for the things that they do with their bodies, but like what it means to like each party. And it helped me sort of find the stakes of the story. And so to me, like power, I feel like I never quite have found my way into a story until I understood which direction the power is flowing. Like the minute I understand like where the power, like who has the power in what scene. And because I think like throughout the story, as I think is the case in every story, or at least a good story, that is not a stable thing. Like in a story, like the configurations of power are constantly changing, and you're up, you're down. This person has money, that person has sex, like, but now this person has sex and that person has the money. And so I love following the fluctuations in power. And I think that all human relationships could, if one wanted, view them through a lens of who has the power and who has what kind of power when, and how all of it changes. And yeah, and so like that was really understanding the power dynamics in the story was what really I thought brought me into sort of deeper understanding of what the people were doing in the story.
That's a really lovely response. Did anyone else want to add to this? Otherwise, I'm gonna, I have a lot of questions tonight. Obviously, we're not gonna be able to get through all of them. I'm gonna ask one more, I suppose, before we kind of transition into Q&A. One or two more quick ones. But transitioning from that, and thinking about Garth, going back to your story, I just want to read a quote that made me think about the anthology as a whole. And the narrator says, but then there's no fathoming pleasure, the forms it takes or their sources. Nothing we can imagine is beyond it. However far the pale of our desires, for someone it is the intensest desire, the key to the latch of the self, or the promised key, a key that perhaps never turns. And for me, like I said, it made me think about the anthology as a whole and kind of this journey of exploration that the readers move through as going through the anthology, but also what the characters, their journey, and I'm sure your journey as a writer and creating these stories. And the quote kind of revealed to me, it revealed itself in different ways within the anthology. One of them kind of being, I guess, like the shame as well, in terms of being able to wanting to express oneself. And kind of, Reese, you spoke to that, and the vulnerability there of expressing yourself, and especially expressing desires, generally speaking. And I wanted to see if you could all just kind of speak to that a little bit, and kind of thinking about, since Reese, you talked about it, but kind of thinking about how expressing kink rather than repressing it in literature or just day-to-day conversation might be able to potentially move us forward as a people, or make us think on a different level in terms of kind of like what the book talks about, like opening up your imagination.
Well, Melissa, I wonder, I would love to hear from you on that question. And then also, I would love to hear from you about the previous question too.
Sure. How do I feel like the words are still coming into focus in my mind, because there is a way that I think the little sort of motion that I imagined that would happen in a society if the stigma were sort of exfoliated away from kink by talking about it, by making what we often think of as unspeakable speakable, then there wouldn't be kink anymore. And in some way, I think that there's an analogy for that in my own relationship to kink, because, and I'm thinking about this also in terms of sort of what Brandon was saying, and very much in terms of really what everyone has said, about sort of power and the way that it shifts and is not always where it first appears to be. And what I see as sort of, and maybe I heard you say some of this, Garth, is that there is, for me, when I think about kink, an element of subversion to it. And for me, like when I was in my late teens, I think, or 20, and I became a pro dom, it felt very subversive and very sort of empowering for me to get paid to dominate men. And it took about 3 years before I started to feel the shift in power that I think maybe had always been there, because I was dominating men by acting out fantasies that they had prescribed to me. And, my experience of sort of investigating my own thinking about it and writing this story really sort of brought me into my own mind and thinking about how powerfully erotic it is to undo whatever script I've been given, whether it's sort of from a client in the dungeon or whether it's through sort of the compulsory heterosexual scripts that have been embedded in my own mind, right? And so the character in my story, it's this very subtle movement, right? And I think, I don't know, her movement away from this man and his pleasure is so quiet and almost invisible in the story. And to me, that seemed like almost at the perfect other end of the spectrum from how I had defined kink when I was 19 or 20 years old. And I would never have gotten there if I hadn't been having conversations about power and sex and the erotic for all of those 10 years in between, if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. Reese, it looks like you're gonna say something. No.
I was just gonna add that I feel as though it might be helpful to say this in terms of the good that can come from talking about things. I will also say that, like, I'm not free, like, I mean, I edited this book with Garth. We put a lot of work into this book. And as did our wonderful contributors. And with all of that, and despite having engaged in like interviews and essays and all of it around this book, I still can't like talk about my sex life with my friends, you know, like if sex comes up at like at like a dinner party back when we had dinner parties, I will shut the fuck up and I'll just like sit there totally incapable of like talking about any part of it without, I mean, I love hearing my friends talk about sex. I just can't say a word. Like my closest friends know nothing about my sex life. And, you know, so I'm a work in progress with the fear and the shame. And I think I'm perhaps going to be a work in progress for the rest of my life. And I think maybe there can be a little bit of peace in knowing that like maybe I'm not going to get free, but I can work toward it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate everyone's responses to all my questions tonight. Like I said, I had a lot, and we got through a decent amount. But I do want to save time for some Q&A questions as well, and some came in. So one question we had is, do you find kink to be highly associated with queer now? In earlier days, I don't think we had the word queer as an identity to link with kink, or maybe more simply, are queer folks by definition kinky? I resist categories for category breakers, but do wonder about associated identities and the permissions they can grant to us all.
Well, I would resist any easy identification of queerness with kink. And I certainly know queer people who are not kinky, or at least do not seem to live their kinks in any ways that might be accessible to the eye, I guess. I mean, who knows what people really are inside, maybe. But, you know, there is a way in which I think queerness and queer communities and kink communities historically there's been a lot of overlap. And, you know, I think queerness has been accommodating of kinkiness, and kinkiness has to a certain extent been accommodating of queerness as well. But I mean, historically, it's just not the case that queerness and kinkiness have always gotten along. I mean, in the 1970s, there were really pretty dramatic debates, especially within the lesbian and radical feminist communities, about the moral status of BDSM. But, you know, thinking about what Melissa was talking about kinkiness and how kinkiness, and also Brandon's brilliant French philosopher quip about kink being context. I mean, I do think kink is always contextual, and there is maybe an aspect of kink that is always in some way adversarial. And, you know, something that is true about culture in a capitalist context is that it is brilliant at commodifying things that attempt to stand in an adversarial relationship to it. So, I mean, I think that, you know, capitalist commodity culture is extremely good at defanging anything that is subversive. And so there's a way that queerness, I mean, something that fascinates me about queerness as an identity is how mobile it has to be in order to hold on to that adversarial quality, to hold on to that kind of radical potential to find new ways to oppose a kind of dominant culture. And I think in some way there might be some kind of analogous situation with kink as well, or at least with certain aspects of kink, that as kink is commodified and turned into sort of 50 shades, that it has to seek out new forms and new practices that find maybe new modes of resistance to a kind of dominant culture, at least for part of kink.
That's really wise, Garth. I just wanted to add another little sort of footnote to your question, Jared, that I totally agree with everything Garth said. And I also do feel like I remember the feeling of like, when I was a teenager and I was having my first queer sex, this sort of vertiginous, like exciting, scary, very liberated feeling of like, oh, I don't know the script for this. Like, I just have to figure out what I want. And that is the same sort of dizzy feeling that I've had in some situations that can be described as kinky, right? And I think that there is a way that as a queer person, I've learned how to be creative as I'm sort of in full sort of flight from the commodification of my desires. I'm also making them up as I go along. And there does seem to be sort of like a common denominator, or that it sort of predisposes me to be more curious about kink, or predisposed me as a younger person to be more curious about it.
Thank you both for answering. Oh, yes, sorry. No, come on.
A lot of cooks in the kitchen. Yeah, I love what Garth and Melissa said. And I would also add, that like, very much so, because this collection has, it's so predominantly queer that at some point Garth and I were like, wait, are there any straight people in this collection? should there be a straight person? Like it was like, we weren't even, of course we very much wanted the anthology to have more queer people than not, more people of color than not, more marginalized genders than not. That said, it was like so easy and natural for most of the stories to be queer. And I do think there has to be some overlap between, if you're queer, as a queer person, I have quite a bit of experience in walking away from received scripts about what my life should look like. And kink can be part of that, walking away from scripts about what sex should be or what it should look like or who it should be between. And yeah, I think that's where there is definitely some overlap. But yes, there's a lot of controversy about whether or not, because there are kinky people who argue that kink should be included under the queer umbrella, and then there are a lot of people who say that it shouldn't be, and it's an ongoing conversation.
Thank you. So another question we have is, thinking through the lens of Carl Phillips on the muscularity and eros of syntax, what are some of your favorite writers of sexy syntax, and how do you see syntax's ability to prolong tension speaking to kink?
I love whoever asked that question. I love you. And Carl Phillips, I love that he's in the room now, his spirit. Also, syntax is my kink. I'll just say that. Syntax is actually like just autobiographically my kink.
I very quickly, I mean, Garth, of course, Garth's syntax is incredible. Proust, naturally. And I'm just gonna say, like, maybe like an unconventional choice is this writer, Alison Weir, who writes like historical books, popular history books. And like there is something so incredible, incredibly, like, yes, muscular and also fluid about her sentences, which often span decades. Across like a single sentence, you get decades of a life, and not just like, oh, he went here and she did that and there was this, but like her sentences contain like the entire birth and death of nations. And like she's able to sort of move from like this great height of like being able to sort of witness the entire nation in one glance, but then also to sort of arrow down with like frightening specificity about like what one person felt in one moment of their life as they watched the whole world change. And like there's something just like so alive and electric and really like potent about the ability to do that. And she's often like doing that by just sort of like linking up sentences, changing rhythm. Like she's quick with a comma and a semicolon. I mean, just like really just phenomenal, incredible syntax. And yeah, I mean, I think about her sentences all the time. So Alison Weir, a perhaps strange choice, but yeah.
I'll add to that I remember I was in a class in grad school with Andre Osman, speaking of sexy syntax, and at some point he just muttered, "Is there anything better in this life than a really good sentence?" And everyone was like, literally, no, there's nothing better. and I'm very much on that side. I'm very much on the side of syntax being incredibly exciting. I'll say a word about the poet since you started with Carl Phillips. I'm so fascinated by the line break, because that is something that as a cannot help being a prose writer. I cannot work with line breaks. Like that is like reason number one why I can never be a poet. But I love poets' line breaks. I love wondering about them. I love staring at them. And two books of poetry that I've been really excited about in the past year include Natalie Diaz's Post-Colonial Love Poem, which is just incredible. You kind of want to like eat the words as you go because they're so beautiful, the way the syllables work together. Oh, it's incredible. I have it on like constant reread now. Like I reread it a little bit from it almost every day. And Diana Coy Wynn, her book Ghost Dove, speaking of syntax, she works with, she cuts out parts of her poems and then reuses them on the next page in really beautiful, interesting ways. And it made me cry and cry and cry, and a lot had to do with that syntax.
And Melissa, do you have anyone you want to add, or?
Sure. I have so many I could add. I would all agree that Garth is actually one of my favorites for the erotic syntax. I'm gonna give an example from the past and an example from the present. And my example from the past, maybe there's actually two. And the first is like the first sort of writer that made me want to write about sex, and that's Jeanette Winterson, and very specifically a section in Written on the Body where, you know, it's like this novel written in like, I mean, she has amazing sentences. There's like no paragraph breaks. The narrator is ungendered. But sort of like, I think 2/3 of the way through the novel, she just breaks into these sections that begin with anatomical definitions. And they're like these hyper lyrical, incredibly erotic, sort of metaphorical odes to sort of the beloved's clavicle or a neck or shoulder blades. And I think actually sort of her willingness to sort of disrupt form and have this sort of like lyrical rupture on the page was some of the sexiest writing I'd ever seen. And also the content of it is, I mean, I teach it in pretty much every class I ever try to teach. And I would also say Eileen Miles's prose, who's also a poet, of course, but it was like some of the first like very specific lesbian sex I ever read about. And I didn't know that consciousness could be sewn into a sex scene the way that she does, and the way that she does it through the language and through the syntax and in the very sentences. And I'm going to go ahead and call out for my contemporary version, my partner, who's actually sitting on the couch behind me. Can I? Okay, I'm just gonna, here she is, Danica Kelly. She has some really amazing poems about sex, including a kind of ode to face sitting that I'm a fan of. And she also has a book coming out this year, which I must say.
She also has a poem about gay porn that makes me scream every time I think about it. It just,
what gay porn has done for me, it's amazing.
Unbelievable, yeah.
Thank you all for sharing. I guess this is a good question to kind of wrap things up on. But it's a question of, do you find this collection more or less relevant today than was conceived in 2017? And I guess I'm going to add to that, just thinking about what I said in the beginning, that we have been in a pandemic for a year and people have been isolated, either alone or with a partner, and of varying degrees of commitment that they might have went into the pandemic with. And what does that feel like in terms of like thinking about desire and not having the ability to touch, whether it's hugging a friend or being with a partner, and how has that felt in terms of thinking about this book now that it's out in the world today?
I want to have two answers. My first answer is that, the primary claim I want to make for the writing in this book is that it is art. And that, as Reese and I were putting together the anthology and thinking about people we wanted to contribute, we were thinking about who among the writers today working is an artist, is someone who conceives of their work as art. And a question about the relevance of art and a shifting relevance of art in relationship to 2017 and 2021, I think has a fundamentally disordered sense of the relationship between art and time, that art is not subject to a sense of relevance in that way. So that's my one answer, is like, relevant, let's get rid of relevance as a sort of term of assessment when thinking about art. My second answer is absolutely, certainly the meaning of this book has changed for me. As you know, the book was almost finished before lockdown. Most of the stories certainly existed before lockdown. And yet, of course, the meaning of those stories, including very much my own story, has radically changed over the course of a year, where certain kinds of touch have not been available to me, and a certain kind of erotic life that depends on the free circulation of bodies has not been available to me. So that's certainly true. I mean, the meaning of the work has shifted for me over the course of this year.
Yeah, absolutely what Garth said. And I would add that I don't know about y'all, but my skin hunger, which is like, I don't know if you know this term, I love it. Skin hunger is like a term for wanting to touch people, like wanting to hug people, and like our bodies want to touch other people. My skin hunger is so intense. Like I keep having these my biggest fantasy right now is like a rave with a mosh pit. I have never been in a mosh pit. I don't think this is really my scene, but like I want a rave with a mosh pit. I want the moshing with like the hugging and the love, you know? But my skin hunger has extended very much to what I'm working on, to my writing. Like I keep being drawn to writing like the party scenes and not so much the like sad by myself scenes, because, or at least for the narrator in the book, because like sad and alone is kind of the predominant mode of this pandemic. And so I'm drawn to reading about like parties. I'm drawn to reading about people's bodies hanging out with one another. And there's a lot of that in this book.
I can go. I think that for me, I mean, my story that's in this book has been with me for like a very long time, and I feel like in some ways, my relationship with that story has been my relationship to like my writing in general. Like I feel like I've like gone inward since 2018, maybe when I wrote that story. But I feel like over the course of like the last year, especially, and it's not, you know, it's not just like the pandemic, it's like the very long year of 2020 that we all like lived through. Um, that whole year, I think, has been a year of like not only like learning a lot about myself, but like thinking very deeply about my relationship like to the world and to art and to like what life is. And I feel like before that whole pandemic, I had maybe, I think, a more naive idea about like what relevance is, and it's like, are people really gonna want to read about kink in 2021? Like we might have a horrible president. Like who knows what's gonna go on? And I think that what that year taught me was just like you know, I think it's maybe a lesson that every artist learns, which is like just like the humility of like facing time and creating art not for the sake of like immediate gratification or like to get hugs from your best friends when you run into them at the grocery store when they read your thing online. Like that's not why we're doing this. Like we are hopefully writing these little missives from deep inside of ourselves, from our own interior countries, these little correspondences that go out into the world and that people find. And people might not find this book until 2025. Like there are going to be people in 2030 who find this book and are like, oh my gosh, like what is this? And for me, my attitude about the book is that I think it's going, hopefully, I hope that people, yes, read it now, but also I'm excited for those moments when young people stumble upon this book and accidentally find their way into our interior countries and feel less alone because of it, you know. And I think about my own encounters with art as like a young person just looking, desperately thirsting for language for my experience and my desires, and like stumbling upon Andre Aciman, stumbling upon Garth, stumbling upon James Baldwin. And I think like what a beautiful thing this book is. It's like a little lifeline thrown out to all those people, you know, who'll come after us and who need these words. So that's how I feel about it. I feel really buoyed and really excited and really moved and humbled to be bundled up with some of my favorite writers.
Well, Melissa, I'll let you give the opportunity if you want to say something. If not, I'll transition. But you know, I do want to thank everyone, our Kwon, Garth Greenwell, Melissa Febos, and Brandon Taylor for joining us this evening. You know, I also want to thank our incredible ASL interpreters tonight, Selena Flowers and Rory Burton of ProBono ASL. Pen Out Loud is PEN America's signature event series focused on amplifying diverse voices and convening battle conversations with authors, poets, journalists, artists, and activists. It's also our honor, again, to be partnered with the Strand bookstore and Scripps Presents for this winter. This is our first event of the season. I also want to thank our regional partners, the Asian American Writers Workshop, Austin Public Library Foundation, Magic City Poetry Festival, Miami Book Fair, and the Magic City Books. This program is also made part possible by a grant from the City of Los Angeles, Department of Cultural Affairs. Next week, please come back and join us. We'll be welcoming National Book Award finalist Brandon Hobson to celebrate his new novel, The Removed, and he'll be joining conversation with Pulitzer Prize finalist Rebecca Makkai. Tickets are on sale. Thank you all again. Thank you, Brandon, Garth, Reese, Melissa. Everyone, please continue to stay safe and have a great evening. Thank you.